Welcome to all of our members, friends, and new listeners to the Global Justice Report. This is an online production of the Center for Global Justice, and I'm Betsy Bowman, your host. The Center for Global Justice, or the Centro para la Justicia Global, Asociación Civil, is a multinational bilingual research center in San Miguel Allende, Guanajuato, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. That's our slogan. Since 2004, we have offered educational programs in English for the expatriates who live here, and also for the winters in the summer and winter. And we also offer programs in Spanish for the larger community. Our vision is to move control of economic life and control of our relations with Mother Earth from the elites, from the 1% to the 99%, to the rest of us. We explore self-management, cooperatives, public banking, and other solutions to the collapse of neoliberal capitalism. The coronavirus has, of course, put into very sharp focus this collapse of neoliberalism, as has the recent state murder of an unarmed Black man and the ensuing countrywide, worldwide demonstrations against long overlooked historical injustices. These events have underscored the necessity for a peaceful and democratic transition to a different world, to a different society and economic system, which we'll be exploring throughout the rest of the summer in our Global Justice Report every Monday at this time. And we'll also be adding programs in Spanish. You'll find more information on our webpage. Today, we are starting with the situation in Mexico. Where is Mexico headed? And I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, Laura Carlsen, who is the director of the Americas program at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. She's an old friend of the center's and an oft invited speaker. And we're very happy that she can be on our inaugural program. I just wish the times were a little happier. The topic of her talk today is social change in times of pandemic. What's changed, what hasn't, and the paths forward. Our second speaker is Hector Ulloa, who is the former editor of our local weekly bilingual newspaper, Atención. So he is a very old friend of San Miguel, and I'm delighted to have him join us in our inaugural production. And the topic of his talk will be the new normality. Are people ready for it? And in the next week, we're going to have a number of professors from universities in Mexico City who will be speaking about specifically working people and what is happening to the workers in Mexico during the COVID crisis, and talking about the new international network called the Workers' Economy. And for the 2 weeks subsequent to that, June 15th and June 22nd, we'll be talking about the global economic situation with Professor Tony Smith. Will the zombie capitals die this time is his topic. And then I'll be speaking on, did the economic collapse precede the COVID pandemic? And I think we'll see it did. But without further words, I'll turn over the floor to Laura. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm sorry we couldn't all be together, but these are not normal times. And it's a pleasure, and I really thank the center for organizing this event here. So I'm sure that for a lot of people, it's very difficult to understand what's happening in Mexico, the Mexican government's response, because of a context of polarization that actually predates the COVID-19 crisis, and that has politicized a lot of what's happening in the health crisis specifically. The government made a decision, just to go briefly over some of the policies and that we've seen here, and the point that we're at right now in terms of the first point, which is the government's response to the COVID-19 crisis. The government made a decision that throughout this, it was going to leave the health crisis in the hands of epidemiologists, of the scientists, but also at the same time attempt to balance the economic costs with the health costs. In developed countries, it's a strategy that's been much criticized, and rightfully so, of sacrificing human lives for the economy. In Mexico, it's a little bit different. There was finally a lockdown, a voluntary one, but it's also a little bit different because in a developing country, you do have a situation where, first of all, there are a number of people who cannot stay home without starving, because they do live on a day-to-day basis. They make enough money to eat by going out in the streets. We're talking about an economy where, according to various different calculations, between 40 and 50 some percent of people work in the informal sector. You run into them all the time. This means that these are people who don't have benefits, who don't have savings, who are just basically getting by. So you would essentially be condemning them to a situation of starvation with a complete lockdown. And the second is that the longer term economic crisis, which ensues from this health crisis in all countries, and we're beginning to see that more and more, could be devastating as well, and cause a threat to actual survival, especially in terms of hunger and basic needs within the country. So in March 23rd, formally, the lockdown started. It's always been voluntary here in Mexico. The government decided to begin the campaign of Quédate en casa, remain at home, but we have not seen what we've seen in other countries, the sanctions or the policing to keep people there. Actually, the police they were here not too long ago. They will kind of drive by and say, what are you doing out in the streets? But, we're not seeing the criminalization of that. That's actually been used in a very concerning way as a way of advancing authoritarianism in other countries throughout the region and throughout the world. After that, many people have seen there's been constant press conferences regarding what's going on. The idea was always, as it has been among epidemiologists in the entire world, to flatten the curve, which is to just draw out the rate at which people become infected with the disease, so that there isn't a sharp peak that could saturate the hospital system. The government has repeated that the hospital system was in shambles as a result of decades of neoliberal governments that, in an attempt to privatize, had essentially abandoned the public health system, as well as the damage that was done to it because of corruption. There were a number of hospitals that were built in terms of just the structure. Some politician goes out to inaugurate this and see this great thing that I did, and the hospital literally never even went into operation, was never equipped, was never staffed, and just remained a shell. After the headlines, touted the infrastructure that was created by whatever politician it was. So there's a lot of gaps in the healthcare system and in the healthcare policies within the country that make it more difficult for Mexico to confront the crisis. Now, throughout this, there's been a lot of criticism of how the government has handled it. There's been a lot of speculation and suspicions about general figures, the number of cases, the number of deaths as a result of this. There's been the mainstream press in the United States has been adamant about criticizing the government in terms of the number of deaths. There was a famous article that caused a lot of polemic on the front page of the New York Times about how the real number was probably 20 times greater. And I think nobody would actually say that these figures are 100% accurate. They're not accurate in any part of the world. There are people who die at home. There's very little testing in Mexico, which is another point that can be criticized. And I won't actually go into all the ins and outs of the polemic that started here. But you can tell how politicized it is, both within the U.S. mainstream press, and certainly here in Mexico as a way to attack the government. And you can also criticize a number of the measures of the government. In the early stage, before the lockdown, the president was extremely careless, both about his own personal actions in terms of the response to the virus, as well as the messages that he was giving out by continuing to go around the country. That's made it much more difficult for when the crisis was really very strong, like it is still now, for people to believe the degree to which they had to be concerned. Because their own president had given this example of kind of nonchalance in terms of the attitude. So there's been mistakes made, there's been politicization of the health crisis. But essentially what's happening is a very big effort, as you can imagine, within the hospitals, within the health system, and within the political system to confront the crisis, to try to explain to people what they're doing and why they're doing it, while at the same time there's been a very concerted effort on the part of the right wing to use this issue also as a point of attack. Right now we're at the peak. We're hoping getting close to the peak anyway, implying that there will be a downhill side soon of the crisis, with between 300 and 500 deaths a day that are counted, and a rising number of cases. So especially here in Mexico City, we really see the impact. It's been announced now that today the campaign for sana distancia is over. So, but the whole country is on a red light on the scale of green, yellow, red, which means that ultimate precautions with the exception of the state of Zacatecas are still in place. There have been some debates about some more sectors being defined, including the maquila on the border, as essential, which could be putting people at unnecessary risk. I've been talking to some people up on the border who are really concerned about what's going to happen there, as auto parts for the United States, is declared an essential sector, which is what they mostly produce. That's the response to the COVID crisis. The response in terms of social programs has been to mobilize resources, and especially communication, and what the programs that have been announced to confront not the health crisis so much as the recession and probable, the depression that will be seen on the economic plane afterwards, are basically programs that were already in place for the fourth transformation. There was an announcement that Mexico could lose 2 million jobs, and the response has been a list of the number of jobs that will be created with programs like Youth Building the Future, which is a jobs program for youth, urban improvement programs, the tree planting programs, the program Sembrando Vida in the southern part of the city, the Tren Maya, and the refinery that's being built in Veracruz. So the problem that I see with these programs is we're not seeing the government really coming out with an additional plan to confront the crisis. Mexico has no unemployment insurance. There's no unemployment benefits for people who lose their jobs. So these 2 million people are going to have to look for these other jobs. And considering what's happening in the private sector, we're going to continue to see a contraction of the job market rather than an expansion. And there are some benefits that are going out to people in the informal sector. They're minimal in my view, and there are the Mexico City and some other states do have some forms of benefits as well that they'll be applying. But again, we're certainly not seeing a New Deal kind of response. The response has been, again, austerity, which, while it is different, it's than the kind of austerity that the IMF and others talk about, in the sense that it's not the withdrawal of the state from the private market in terms of how the economy runs. It's a different kind of austerity that has to do with trying to cut waste and corruption within the government, and also where government servants at higher levels take cutbacks in their own salaries and wages. But on the other hand, it's an austerity response. Any way you look at it, and we're beginning to see some cuts that are really going to hurt, and not really seeing the kind of expansion of social programs that you might expect under a different kind of a progressive government. We'll see what happens in the future as the economic crisis begins to take shape, but that's what's happening right now. Things like the pensions for older people, for students with low incomes, and for people with disabilities, those have been elevated to the constitutional level. So we still see within the fourth transformation this commitment to a redistribution of wealth. It could be that a crisis like this actually could further that, where we've seen a very firm refusal, for example, to create any packages or measures really, that would bail out the private sector, which has enraged them and caused some of a lot of the attacks that we're seeing right now. And a commitment to create, some kind of a commitment to benefit the poor. But again, I think that what's lacking there is we're not really seeing the creation of an emergency social safety net like we've seen in wealthier countries. Part of it is, of course, because the resources aren't there to do that. But another part has to do with kind of just this concept of continuing with the plans that were in place before the health crisis, when in fact we're in a very different moment now that no one could predict, and that, at least in my opinion, will require some stronger measures in the future. The government has decided, has stuck to its guns regarding no fiscal reform, which will be limiting in terms of what it can do to strengthen the health system in general, and also to strengthen the health system as this particular health crisis continues, because as many of you know, they talk about not only getting over this hump, but also the very strong possibility in Mexico and on the global level that there will be another wave of COVID-19 in the fall, like probably about October or so. So the virus with the vaccination a ways away, even in the best scenario, is something that will be affecting our lives and the economy and the politics of all countries. Mexico very, very directly, for a long time to come. And I say Mexico very directly because it is happening in the context of when the government was expecting to be moving forward with some fairly deep reforms in many different areas. And there's a discussion now about how deep they were actually going to end up being. But now with the health crisis, everything really has to be thought through again, and in a very, very changed context. There's a couple things that that we've been taking a close look, issues in particular that we've been taking a close look at in this COVID-19 crisis here in Mexico, and one of them is militarization. I mentioned that the government did not go the criminalization route. If you look at El Salvador today, if you look at a number of other countries, but in our region, I think El Salvador has been the biggest example of an authoritarian response. You see these mandatory lockdowns. Honduras also has it, and they have literally locked people down into hunger. And you see these mandatory lockdowns that have been a pretext for the military in the streets, for massive repression and criminalization in many cases, specifically of opposition or of defenders with the excuse of the coronavirus. And it's also, and this is the biggest long-term concern, been a pretext for the suspension of civil liberties and power grabs by even elected officials, but with authoritarian tendencies. So what's happened here is, since the lockdown has been voluntary, and they have repeatedly said, the government has repeatedly said that they will not go that route because of the issues of human rights that are involved, one could think that, we've dodged that bullet. But the concern is that a tremendous amount of resources and power have been given to the armed forces during this period. One of the specific things that happened is that there was a decree when people were distracted with the coronavirus that essentially it's a follow-up to what already happened last year, which was the law that created the National Guard. But in this decree, the armed forces are essentially given complete policing powers within the country. Now, to have the armed forces take on public security is something that is considered taboo, should be avoided at all costs by all international human rights organizations. And we also see, aside from the militarization that is measured by the deployment of troops in the street, we also see the armed forces being given control and a tremendous amount of resources for providing health services and running hospitals. And we also see the armed forces doing security missions for hospitals. And in general, this predates the crisis, building airports, and we see this expanded role, which I think from a feminist perspective, particularly with the critique of the patriarchal hierarchy in the armed forces and the training to annihilate enemies and the use of force to resolve social problems, it sets off a series of red flags there in terms of the direction that Mexico is heading as the armed forces begin to take on more power there. Having mentioned the feminist perspective, which is always a part of my analysis, the other source of concern is the role of women and how it's being dealt with within this crisis throughout the world. What's become evident is the importance of women's work in a care economy, as taking care of their families, taking care of the children, taking care of the elderly. They're also the majority of nurses, the majority of healthcare workers in general in many countries, and really very prevalent and underpaid in most care sectors. So as this becomes more visible, one would think perhaps there would be public policies that would recognize not just the value, the essential nature, and I don't mean essential like forcing people to work when their lives are at risk. I mean essential in terms of how does a community survive, of women's work. And we have not seen that in Mexico. And this comes on top of what many of you know has been a very problematic relationship between this government and the women's movements in terms of its response to violence against women and the insistence by the president himself that feminism, he's not a feminist, but a humanist. In other words, a refusal to recognize that there is a patriarchal system. That means that women cannot be, and women's oppression cannot be seen as indiscriminate from the poor, from oppression in general. I mean, there's a complete cluelessness in this area, as a matter of fact, and it's going to cost us as we move into the economic crisis and the response to the health crisis, because women are not getting the kind of support they need to continue to do the essential work that they need. He made a statement that, well, the Mexican family is the most important social security organization that we have. And luckily we have millions of nurses. That is women who are unpaid and unrecognized, who are going to jump in to care for the sick in their families, to care for the children who aren't in school. And they're going to do this because that's just what they do. And this assumption that this is their role, and that this is not something that a government or a state has to compensate or support in any form, is really damaging to try to rebuild on the basis of a care economy that can not only get us through this crisis, but make us safer and prevent other crises in the future. The same can be said with the programs that I mentioned that are slated to produce the jobs that will be needed in the crisis. Many of them are extractivist. Many of them are neoliberal in essence, in terms of attracting foreign investment. Many of them are fossil fuel oriented. And so we're betting on a new future or a new normality that essentially has already been proved to be conflictive, to be unsustainable, and to be not in the interest of the nation and the planet as a whole, because of the nature of many of those projects. And so we're not seeing a real rethinking of those kinds of those kinds of commitments, which again are part of the original program of the fourth transformation, have been criticized since then. And now in the context of the crisis, they're the fallback for supposedly coming out of the crisis itself, when what we really need is a radical rethinking of it in general. I wanted to end with the discussion of where that puts us as movements in Mexico and as international movements, because there's been a lot of discussion about that, obviously not just in Mexico, but throughout the world. What are the opportunities and the limitations and the risks of this particular moment? And I think all those exist. You can't talk about the opportunities without the risks. There's sometimes, find people say this has revealed the faults and the contradictions in capitalism. That's clearly true. It will change probably some, it'll change probably some of the people's minds when they see how the system isn't working in very basic ways. But it doesn't mean it's the end of capitalism. There's a number of ways out of this crisis that could reinforce, and we've seen it happen before, could reinforce some of the most authoritarian, some of the most unequal, and some of the most predatory and unsustainable forms of capitalism that there are. So we're on the point of probably the biggest battle we've ever seen in our lives in terms of the different routes out of this crisis. And if we aren't involved every step of the way, it could go from bad to worse. But we're seeing really, really positive signs at the same time. You guys there in San Miguel have seen the new forms of solidarity that are coming up spontaneously, because people recognize that we're all in this together. And the concept of public health, as well as the concept of just surviving as a species and as societies, dictates that if we don't see it that way, we won't survive. I think the the disease that's one of the lessons that it teaches us too. So people are self-organizing, they're identifying the vulnerable sectors, trying to get help to them while at the same time, taking protective measures. And again, women are very, very involved in these kinds of things. That's a positive sign forward. There's also a renewed emphasis on internationalism that the Global Justice Center has always worked in. We're seeing more initiatives. The issue of migration has come to the fore in Mexico in this case too, because Central American migrants are stuck. Trump is using it to close off the border, even by eliminating asylum and refugee rights against all international laws, and continuing with this white supremacist agenda. So the Central American migrants are stuck. The Mexican migrants are being sent back. The disease is rampant among populations that not only don't have a home, but they don't have a country in many ways. So that's been coming up a lot, and we're seeing new initiatives to link people in the United States that work on migrant rights, and in Mexico and in Central America. And that's just one example where this concept of internationalism is really becoming much more prominent, especially in terms of getting together on these kinds of platforms and looking at what we can do to bring this around to strategies for systemic change, for deep systemic change. I'll leave it there and look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laura. And now we'll turn immediately to Hector Ulloa, and we'll have questions and answers for both Laura and Hector after Hector speaks. It's an awful lot of information to process, but I'm learning a lot from it, and even though I live here in Mexico. So Hector, if you would please take the floor.
Sure thing. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope that what I have to say is also as useful. I chose to talk about the new normality and whether people are or aren't ready for it. And I think the new normality has a lot to do with health issues, social issues, and of course, economic issues. In terms of the economy, the only thing I will say is it's been a while since Mexico saw its true large economic crisis. However, ever since I was a child, every time I think back, I remember my father saying that we were in a crisis of some sort. So in a way, Mexico has always been in a crisis. Every 6 years, we just changed the type of crisis, but we've always been in some sort of a crisis. However, not like the one we're facing today, I think. I think this is a major thing. And even though the government has managed to, for example, collect back taxes to a huge amount, 1.5 billion pesos. And here it's important to note that a billion in English is 1,000 million, but a billion in Spanish is 1 million million. So what has been collected is actually 1.5 million pesos. And it's not a lot, but it's still, as far as I could figure it out, somewhere around 5 or 6% of the GNP, which is interesting. This money was not expected, and now it's here. It's just a matter of knowing what they plan to do with it. It's already there. I don't think it's allocated yet. In terms of health and social-wise as well, I think most people are not ready for a new normality because they don't even know what it's about. Most people don't really know what the new normality involves. The government has not been clear enough about what this new normality brings about. If we need to live, on lockdown permanently or until there's a vaccine or something, it has been said that we will be able to leave our homes and go back to work, those people who need to go back to work, who need to go out on the streets again. But then again, there's this traffic light that has put the whole country on the red light as of this moment. So are we going back to the streets right now? No, we're not. That's the reality of it. The idea is that as we move on from the red to the green, little by little, businesses will start to reopen. However, at this point, the whole country, except for Zacatecas, is on the red light. So I don't see any part of it really opening up anytime soon. Here where I live, however, is a different story. I live in Toluca, just 60 kilometers away from Mexico City. And people here live as if there were no tomorrow, as if nothing were happening, and they're just, leading their lives the way they used to. That's a big risk because that brings about the risk of a new wave of contagion. But people don't seem to understand it. So if we think of what these 2 months have brought about, we might think, well, people have understood that this is a major issue and that we should be aware and take care of ourselves, etc. I think part of the population has understood that, but a large part of this same population either doesn't understand it or they simply don't care. There's a neighborhood in town here where I live that has had the largest number of deaths from COVID. And still, they're celebrating out on the streets. And when police come around and tell them that they have to, go back inside and stop their parties and everything, they say, well, we need to exercise our right to die if we want to. Of course, this involves their neighbors as well. And that's where I don't understand it. Anyway, if what we have seen in the course of these last 2.5 months of lockdown is what part of the new normality will be, it's not encouraging. People are getting ready to go on a vacation, not to start over little by little. No, people are just fed up and they just need to go out and probably, go on a trip and go to the beach and something like that. As a matter of fact, the airlines are now offering huge discounts on airplane tickets to the major resorts like Cancun and Vallarta. So with that in the middle of everything, how can we expect it to work? People are going to leave their homes and get an 800 peso ticket to Cancun. That's what it costs right now, an 800 peso ticket to Cancun. And people in Mexico are special. We always say that there's a certain degree of fatalism. Most people believe in fate. And they say, well, if it's my time, if my time should come, well, so be it. and away they go. And they you know, it seems like people don't care. Just this morning, I saw a video of people standing in line in Celaya yesterday, standing in line to buy beer because the beer store opened after 2.5 months. And you might think, I thought people were worried about, money to bring food, to put food on the table. Well, apparently not. Apparently they were more worried about, there's no beer. What are we going to do? And there was a huge line of people outside this place in Celaya because they just opened again for business. And that's what was more important to them. There was an elderly woman on the line, and the reporter asked this woman what she was doing there, why she was buying beer. And she said, well, it's for my children. They couldn't come, so I'm standing here in line, and I've been here for 2 hours, and I'll stand here for 2 hours more if it takes that long, just to buy beer for her kids. That's the impressive thing. On the other hand, Mexican people are well known for their solidarity in times of trouble. We saw that in 1985 after the earthquake, and we saw it again in 2017 after the earthquake. And people come out and help each other, and I think that's fantastic. But it doesn't seem to be happening right now. Maybe because people don't see this as a catastrophe. Maybe because it's happening so slowly, they don't see it as a catastrophe. So why should I care? I mean, somebody died. Yeah, that was probably 5 miles away. I didn't even know them. So until there's a death in the family, they seem not to be aware of what's going on. And I think that's what the pandemic has brought as a problem. The lack of awareness. We can't see the virus. So, and many people truly believe that if I can't see it, it's not there. If I can't see it, it doesn't exist. No, nobody in my circle of friends has died, so probably doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, many people have believed that this is some sort of a plan of the government to keep them at home. Some other people thought, well, maybe this is some plan of the government to get rid of the elderly, because that's the group in the highest situation of risk. So you see, there's a lot of information everywhere, and most of it is either false, blatantly false, or completely distorted. So people don't really know what's going on, not because there hasn't been enough information, but because there has been too much information. Social media have been an awful part of this misinformation. If anybody publishes anything that has to do with the pandemic, and it's not even true, but 5 or 10 or 5,000 people read it, some of them will start to believe it. So what's the new normality? Nobody really knows. Where are we headed? Nobody really knows. Or they can't trust any source, not even the government. So what are we going to do? Nobody really knows. No, I've asked several different people what the new normality is for them, and some of them said, "Well, we're going to have to work harder, to make ends meet, But I know of a lot of people who have continued working, even people who own their own businesses, and even though they saw some difficulties in making enough money to pay their rent or something like that, they continued to do business. people selling hamburgers, the guy who sells tamales on a bicycle outside, he's still in business and he's still selling. There are people here, out here in my neighborhood with selling food out of the trunk of their cars. So they have found a way. Of course, this is a segment of the population that doesn't need much to make ends meet. So anything that comes in, any income, as small as it might be, is okay. I think there's a higher level of income, people with a higher level of income who are probably more worried about this because they're not making enough money to pay for their the standard of life, or their lifestyle. And I think that's a bigger problem. But 50% of the people in Mexico, they were already poor before, so they continue being poor now. See, so this is this other level of people who are worried. And health-wise, I think if right now people are already thinking that today is the day when everybody can go out again, we will not have to wait until October to see a second wave of contagion. It's very possible that we see this within 2 weeks. Because when everybody said, quarantine is over, June the 1st, let's go to the beach, let's have a party, let's celebrate. And this could bring a serious problem. If we could avoid this peak of contagion at the beginning of the month, we may see it coming within the next 2 or 3 weeks. And then the hospitals will be overwhelmed. And then there will be no room for all the people that acquire the disease. I think that's what could happen. Unless somebody comes out and says clearly what this new normality is, because some people are thinking, well, the new normality is that we will not be able to hug anybody or kiss anybody. And of course, that's not going to happen. I can see myself wearing a mask, on the street every day. I can see myself wearing some sort of protection for my eyes, but there are many people who can't see that, who will not do it. On the other hand, Mexico is not a place where people can stand apart from each other. Everything here has been always directed to the masses, markets, buses, what's going to happen in the subway in Mexico City? What's going to happen there? Are people going to stand 4 feet apart? No, I don't think so. And if we go to the Central de Abasto, the big markets, are people going to stand 4 or 5 feet apart? I don't think so, because the aisles are so narrow. You're always moving around, elbowing people everywhere. That's going to happen again. So that's one of the problems. Another problem is schools. Most schools in Mexico, most classrooms in Mexico are too small. Back in the, what was it? Can't remember the date, but it was when López Portillo was president. He announced that the education, the need for schools in the country had been satisfied. Had they built more schools? No, they decided to increase the number of students per classroom and to have 3 shifts. then there was a morning shift, an afternoon shift, and a night shift in the same building. I always tell people that when I attended elementary school in Monterrey, Mexico, my group, we were 20 students in a classroom that could have easily fit 80. But then I went to Mexico City to continue high school, and we were 80 students in a classroom that barely fit 20. So until this problem is really solved, it doesn't matter if everybody is wearing a mask and people are so close together that the risk of contagion is rampant, is still there. So I don't think the new normality is very encouraging, and I don't think people are ready for anything but the way they used to live until a few of these things change. Now, buses, city buses, are owned by politicians, and they want their gains. They will not resign to their income from those buses that are always packed full. So they're not going to build buses where people can sit 4 feet apart. So what's going to happen there? How does that fit the new normality? It doesn't. Most of what we have in the country doesn't fit any kind of new normality. Now, some of us may be aware of the fact that the risk of contagion is still there. It's still out there. The virus will be out there for at least a year and a half, 2 years more, until there's a vaccine and it begins to work. Because the fact that we have a vaccine, say by December, doesn't mean that everybody will receive it by December. So there's a time period where people need to be vaccinated, and that will take another 4 to 6 months. So in the meantime, some of us know that our life will change. We will not be able to leave our homes, especially if you are part of these groups in risk, like if you're over 60, or if you are diabetic, or if you have heart problems, or if you have whatever other thing, overweight or whatever else. And some of us will be aware of that when we'll stay home. But I think when I say some of us, I'm thinking what, 10, 20% at the most? And the rest, where will the new normality be for them? I can't see it. I don't see it here in this town. And I can't see it anywhere else.
Hector, for your observations and thoughts. And you're right. How are we going to know when the pandemic is over? And it is not going to end from one day to the next.
Right.
We know that, and it's very problematic. And not just developing a vaccine, but then how do you make 7 billion doses of it for everyone in the world? And many people won't want to take it. But we've got a number of questions here, and I was wondering if you have some concluding remarks.
Well, my concluding remark is, first, we don't know what the new normality is, not clearly. But whatever it is, it's not encouraging. Not if we take into account what we have seen in the course of the last 2.5 months.
Laura, how do you see things as evolving? Hector is very pessimistic. On the other hand, see this as a pivotal moment where, among all of the thousands and thousands of groups internationally who are working for changing policies on regarding the climate, changing policies regarding healthcare, instituting a universal basic income, because there are so many people around the world who do not have just the merest assured income to survive on. What kinds of possibilities do you see coming out of this now? I agree. On the one hand, it's going to be very uncertain. We never know when this is going to be over. But on the other hand, we have time to plan and think of alternatives and how we can implement them.
Yeah, I think so too, and to continue to be as aware of the situation as we can, to watch what's happening, in other countries, where some countries are taking initiatives that could be replicated, where some countries are facing challenges, that could be really dangerous, and to be able to support each other across borders as well. I think that it is a pivotal moment, and there is a real possibility that we can expose some of the deepest contradictions that exist, not just at this moment, that it existed before. You can't really think about the new normality without thinking about the old abnormality. And that is to say that there was not peace, there was not justice, and everything was not fine before this happened. And so if we have to reconstruct, we might as well reconstruct a much better house. And we have what we need to do that. But we also face a lot of obstacles. Just the fact that we can't mobilize is a big thing. I think it's interesting what we're seeing in the United States now, because it got to the point where people were willing to risk their lives to go out and demonstrate. You see in a lot of the riots, or a lot of the marches, that people are wearing face masks. There isn't a lot of social distancing, but it was a point at which the inability to tolerate that old abnormality, which was so grossly unfair and even murderous, became greater than the knowledge that we have to protect ourselves from the virus. So I'm not saying that we should mobilize physically. I don't think that, but I'm not condemning it either. I'm just saying that that's a limitation at this point for what we can do, and the system is very well aware of it. When we see certain things being kind of slipped through, especially in other countries, that when they know that we can't organize a protest or a response in the same way, there's a very real danger that this will be a new strategy on the part of the right. What we do have to do, and I think that we're beginning to see it, and there's a lot of possibilities, is be really creative, about how we organize. And a lot of it has to do with to keep talking to each other and trying to understand the situation and the opportunities and limitations that it presents. And people are doing that all over the world. It's been really interesting in that sense, even though we get kind of burnt out on webinars sometimes.
Yeah.
They're beginning to have health studies about the damage of webinars. No, but really it is an opportunity in that sense. I think there has to be a lot of analysis too. There has to be a lot of analysis of what those contradictions are and how we can push at this time for a new kind of a society. But there also has to be a lot of analysis of what kind of society do we want. So we're beginning to see people think in bigger ways than perhaps they had within movements before. If they were before an opposition, an opposition movement, now they have to be not only an opposition movement, but okay, that's what we don't want, and here's what we do want. And here's how it fits into a new kind of society. We've been talking a lot about since I work a lot in the security part, about well, this is really the proof that human security is not at all the same as national security. Well, the nations were building up arms to fight each other, or to fight immigrants, or to protect the nation state. There were these new threats that were going to affect our lives far more, and nobody was even paying attention to them. So now we have to really broaden out that concept of security, and actually it not only is broader than the concept of national security, but it's in direct contradiction. We're going to have to fight hard to make sure those defense budgets, which are so bloated, so corrupt, so wasteful, and so destructive, are channeled into human needs, which are going to be so pressing in these days. There's a series of battles like that, but they're battles that enable us to go into the discussion of what kind of values we hold dearest and what kind of priorities we want to see in a new society.
Thank you, Laura. There are several questions. I don't know if you can see them on your computers.
No, we can't.
One from Maricela Daniel is a question for Laura. Why do you think that AMLO has given an even more prominent role to the military? And why is the government avoiding a tax reform, even though the sources of income have fallen?
Those are really good questions, and they're very difficult questions. On the military one, which I can answer or just reflect on maybe a little bit more because it's more in my area. It seems to be that there's a very real concern about coup d'etat and what can happen to a progressive government when the military turns against it. And so there's been a process of courting the military throughout this. Other than that, there also seems to be a lack of any real critique of militarism as a form of government, or as a pillar of government, and as something that's harmful to societies. So those would be the two things that I can say about that. The fear of a right-wing military, and the lack of a critique of militarism itself in the sense. And so there's been a very clear process from the beginning of the administration to court the military and to create a very strong relationship, which was, for many of us, a big disappointment, since one of the big selling points in some ways of the campaign of López Obrador was that there was going to be a new security model, that the Merida Initiative would end with the United States, that the war on drugs would end. And so far, we have not seen a change in model in that area, although we've seen some indications of things, perhaps like that we will put public safety before others, but even the beginning of the National Guard and the idea that there's a 5-year limit and it will be turned into a civilian force, we haven't seen a transition to that. And what we have seen is the legalization of the role of the armed forces in domestic security.
Right.
So that's a big concern. And on tax reform, it was a promise of the campaign that there would be no tax reform. It was a promise that was important to some parts of the private sector. And so I don't have a deep knowledge in this area, but my feeling is, number one, it's again, the fact that the fourth transformation and the president, Lopez Obrador, had this very clear idea of what he wanted to do, and he's very reluctant to deviate from that, even when circumstances have changed substantially. In other words, the number one explanation is a certain stubbornness. And then number two, again, a fear of a right-wing reaction. And then, of course, the third is the point that Hector made, that they have been able to advance in the area of just applying the tax laws that exist currently, and that it has resulted in being an additional revenue source. And so they may feel that if they proceed along those lines, it wouldn't be necessary to open up, the very controversial area of a tax reform.
Yes, I have heard that the government is pursuing Walmart, which being somewhat familiar with Walmart in the U.S., I'm glad to see that they're pursuing Walmart in Mexico.
So that's 8,000 million pesos that they just announced that Walmart is paying. And so they're talking about, should that be applied to unemployment? The Bank of Mexico is suggesting that, and they're looking at how it can be used.
That's great. There's a question for you, Hector. COVID-19 has shown even more the inequalities in Mexico, and they're growing all the time. What measures need to be put into place to reduce them? Or is this increased poverty the new normal? And I think that's a question that we can ask about the globally. Is the new normality globally going to be increased poverty?
I think the inequality has been a part of Mexico for many, many years. At my last talk at the Center for Global Justice in San Miguel, I said that it's about less than 1% of the people make 10 times the minimum wage. Less than 1% of the people. So what do you mean by increased poverty? that now it's going to be 99.5 instead of 99. I mean, Mexico is already a poor country, despite the figures handled in macroeconomics, where it says that our gross national product is, brings us within, I think it's the 15th place in world economies. Well, yes, but it's unequally divided. So is this going to make more people poorer, or is this going to make simply people poorer? Like I said a while ago, I think most of the people I know have continued to work. Mexico has, according to Social Security, there are like 20 million people employed and registered at the Social Security. Of those 20 million, the rest of the people are working on different conditions. There are like 5 million bureaucrats registered with ISTE or other Social Security system. But there are like 20 million people registered at IMSS. Of those 20 million, I understand almost 1 million jobs have been lost. Will that make the country poorer? No, I think 1 million out of the 500,000 or 500, what is it? We have 120 million inhabitants, of which 50% have jobs. And I don't think that will make the country poorer. I don't think that will bring down the inequality or increase it. I think this government has set its goals on reducing inequality. Whether they will achieve it or not, I'm not sure. But I don't think this pandemic will seriously affect that. It will affect a certain segment of the population, no doubt about it. But the country is already poor. People are already poor.
That is very, very true. Here's a question for either of you. What is the role of Morena in addressing some of the concerns? Communication, organizing, policy development. Laura, maybe you could speak to that, the role of Morena. And also,
Well, considering that,
internationalism. That's another question from the same person. How do we exercise support from across the border?
okay. Well, considering that Morena governs in the federal government, the Congress, and a large number of the states and municipalities, it has a very prominent role. Now, the way that things work as a party, because there have been so many problems in terms of the internal leadership, as you're not going to have a situation where the party is defining policies that then apply. What you have is a situation where the president is defining policies, and then the individual politicians are defining policies at the level in which they're governing. So as a party itself, you will find I think we'll find it has a minimal role because it doesn't seem to be capable of playing a stronger role. And as governors that work within that party, they have a major decision-making role to play in terms of what happens as a result of this crisis, and also just on a day-to-day level. The issue of internationalism. Let's see. I mean, I know that there's been a reactivation, like I said, in some of the networks, both the binational, in particular, Mexico and the United States, with participation of Central America as well on the issue of migration. I think it's important not to feed the fires of polarization here by being aware as an internationalist, as someone who cares about both countries. When you read a news article, okay, this is supposedly information on COVID-19, but there's very little information and a lot of Mexico bashing, for example. To be discriminate about what kind of news you're reading and what real information does it have and what political agenda does it have. And then I actually disagree. I think we are going to see a very serious problem with an increase in poverty. And we probably will see a very serious problem in an increase in inequality as well, because we're already seeing the studies come out on a global level of how the billionaires are going to and will continue to profit from this crisis. They're making more money. There's a lot of hand-wringing about what's going to happen to certain companies and corporations, but a recent study by IPS came out and said the billionaires are doing fine, thank you. And you look at the stock market, and especially the financial, the financial sphere, and the capacity to make money off of crisis has been well established since before this happened. So in Mexico, I think that there are people that we not only had a country where half the people were living in poverty, but there was also then a huge amount that were right on the edge. And so I think that many of those people that were on the edge will fall into poverty, and many of the people who are in poverty will fall into extreme poverty, as not just incomes break down, but systems break down. For example, you could say a subsistence farmer will still be able to produce corn, or a street vendor will still be able to produce, to sell tamales, since it's not a very strict lockdown, and it's probably going to be loosening up, I think, because just the attitudes of people that Hector was talking about. But that person who produces corn depends at least somewhat on a market for to have some cash to be able to buy the other things that he or she needs. And the person who sells tamales in the street depends to at least somewhat on other systems to be able to function, and to either supplement that income or I mean, I think that it will affect people. So in that scenario, it's important for internationalists to look where the greatest needs are going to be, to donate when they can to some of the organizations that are going to be covering those greatest needs, and to look to also how they can influence US policies that are probably under a Trump administration going to be exacerbating the negative impact of the crisis. So we'll see people coming out with campaigns, with information that highlights some of those policies that are the most harmful. And it will be important to create international alliances to push in the direction of humanitarian policies and away from the kinds of policies that could make the capitalist system stronger and even more dangerous for the vulnerable sectors as we go deeper into this crisis.
One listener has commented that despite the risk of coronavirus, people across the United States are out in the streets demonstrating over the murder of George Floyd and other Black people. But we also see people very concerned on both sides of the border about the people in detention camps waiting for asylum or some kind of legal processing to enter the United States. And I think there is a great deal of support for freeing people from the detention centers. And I think that is going to increase. But it is going to take a very strong social movement to convince the U.S. government to release the people who are in detention centers, and very strong social policies to avoid even more people falling into poverty. The way you describe Mexico is half the people living in poverty, and a lot of people being very close to that line. Well, it's the same in the United States, actually. Almost half the people are living in poverty, and a lot are very close to that. And they're going to be pushed further into poverty unless there's a concerted movement for extended unemployment benefits, universal health care, universal basic income, public banking. And you're absolutely right to emphasize that the billionaires are doing extremely well. It is shocking how many billions a week or per month that the head of the CEO of Amazon is raking in. And yet he doesn't provide protective equipment for his employees. I think that there's at a global level, we see unrest everywhere. And of course, a lot of people are oblivious, but there is a huge amount of unrest, and there has been for a number of years now, about the growing inequalities and the obscene disparities. And I think that at this pivotal moment, we can hope for positive change. And we can hope, if people are willing to go out in the streets of the US, in spite of the dangers of the pandemic, to protest the killing of yet another Black man, I think that people are going to be willing to go out into the streets and protest that their standard of living is being pushed down yet again and again. And that the treatment of the migrants trying to come into the United States, the only word for it is cruel. It's shocking. It's shocking how humans can treat other humans that way. It's shocking how the Trump administration is reacting, and I think people are willing to risk the contagion because of the extent to which the situation has deteriorated and has so quickly. So I'm hopeful that there can be more international alliances. Another listener has asked, on gender issues, a concerted strategy is necessary so as not to lose the gains that have already been made. Can you talk about the efforts that you may know in this regard? International alliances can be very positive. So can either of you address the alliances at an international level of gender gains? Or just again, there was another transgender person on speaking about the murders of transgender men in the United States, or transgender people.
I'll leave that to Laura. Gender issues.
Yeah, I was saying in the bio that I've been working lately with Just Associates, which is an international feminist organization. We have been watching it a lot. The latest was on May 26th, and I haven't looked at it in depth. The Secretary of Government, Gobernación, had another press conference on the gender issues. And they are recognized, the government has recognized from the beginning that there's this big threat of increase or risk of increase in domestic violence in confinement, because we're forcing women to remain in homes that are actually, I think the figure was like 60% of violence against women takes place in the home, in homes that are not only unsafe, but they're dangerous for them. So that was anticipated from the beginning. What's happened, and again, this is that cluelessness that I was referring to before, is that although the government is aware of it and has responded with some policies, for example, now what they said on the 26th, one of the things was that 911 was the number to report violence, and that they're now going to specially train people in domestic violence. There was a statement by the president who said that 90% of calls on domestic violence are false, and that actually the family is the most important unit the Mexican society has for protecting itself during this crisis. Well, what was false was the president's statement. 90% of the calls, there's always, 911 number, there's always a high percentage of false calls, but they only when they break it down by domestic violence or what other kinds of calls are coming in, they only count the calls that have been validated. They don't count the ones that were not substantiated. And in addition, there was a number of other problems with that, with the kind of the figure he was making. But of course, the biggest problem was that to say something like that is to delegitimize an extremely important social problem. and that he's already had, before the lockdown, probably the challenges from a women's movement of the size and force that we have not seen in this country before. If we look at what happened on March 8th, against calling for the government to do something serious about femicides and violence against women, to then come back and reiterate this concept that all we have to do is end neoliberalism and move forward with the fourth transformation in general for the problems of violence against women and discrimination to disappear is just extremely insensitive, to say the least. And it's dangerous on a political and a physical level for women themselves. The economic part of what needs to be done, and I think something does need to be done, the global strike is, the proposals are for direct compensation to be given to women who are doing those jobs that are unpaid in the home, caring for the sick, taking care of children, that women themselves receive a compensation for that. It gives them the kinds of economic independence. And yet what we saw is that of all those pension programs, the one for single women-headed households is the one that didn't make it, that they did not propose to become constitutional. And in the kinds of the proposals that we've seen so far, there isn't a recognition of the unpaid work of women in the policy proposals, unfortunately. And if there's something that I missed, I'd really appreciate it if somebody called my attention, but I've actually looked for it and have not been able to find that. There's a lot of proposals coming out on the international level, and they can make our movement here in Mexico stronger. There's proposals in Ireland, they do have a compensation. There's child credits that are coming up. And they're working hard to make sure those go into the hands of women who are doing the primary child care and not into husbands, where oftentimes women cannot have the kind of access to the resources and that they need, even though they're the ones doing the work. There's calls, more specific programs aimed at addressing the problem of violence against women in confinement in other countries than what we're seeing in Mexico. So the information sharing on some of those policy proposals and why they're so necessary to creating that new society and rebuilding after, or I don't even know how much of an after there is going to be to this particular health crisis, but as we move to adapt to and hopefully, come out of the health crisis and deal with the economic crisis, we need to have that information sharing. And there are some proposals out there that can be very helpful on an international level.
I remember the wages for housework movement in the United States in the 1970s. And maybe we should have invite some of those people to give us a presentation about how that led to other things in the United States. Certainly not wages for housework, but to raise the awareness of the amount of unpaid labor that women do. Someone else has a question. This will have to be our last question as we need to wrap up. Subsistence farmers. Of course, 90% of the farmers in the world are women. Is there any kind of help for subsistence farmers, or any kind of rations being delivered in the poorest areas? Do you know of anything? Either you, Hector, or you, Laura.
Mm-hmm. I haven't heard of rations being delivered in the country, not by the federal government, at least. I understand that, for example, in several communities close to Toluca, the municipal governments are delivering rations to people, not from the federal government. This has been more at a local level. On the other hand, as far as I understand, there is economic help for the reactivation of the of farms. And the idea, at least if it hasn't been approved completely is that there is, again, what they call the guaranteed price for the production of corn or wheat or whatever. That it used to be there many years ago, and then they took it away, and then it was all left to the supply and demand. And so farmers would farm whatever they could, and then tried to sell it. But of course, they would sell to the powerful company and not to other people, and they would just chop down their prices. But I think they're trying to reinstate the guaranteed prices. I'm not sure where that stands at this point, but it should be. And I'd like to add something to what Laura said a moment ago about moving towards salaries or some kind of compensation for women who carry out unpaid jobs. I think that would be a fantastic thing to do now that more women are in Congress. However, and this is just my opinion about it, but sometimes if there is such a thing, some of these women seem to be misogynist. Some of these women in Congress, and they don't exactly help these initiatives forward. And I think this should be the time, now that there's at least half of the people in Congress are women, it should be the time to push these initiatives forward. And I'm not sure that's easy.
Laura, do you have a response to Hector on that? The issue of women's misogyny is a very complex and very explosive issue, which is not discussed for the most part. But we all know that there are women in the elites who are not concerned about the poor women who are subsistence farmers. But is there help for the subsistence farmers?
Well, there are two different questions there, I think. On the last one, which has to do with gender, I think what we're seeing is the limits of parity. You know, the government, I do agree that it's an achievement to have women equally represented in Congress and in the cabinet, because we're half the population, and so should be, as decision makers as well. And so, yeah, but I agree that it's been disappointing, the results. I think that there's a combination of factors going on. There are some feminist women who have a long history of feminism who are in those positions in the Morena party, and then there are others who don't. And so first of all, we have the fact that, you know, just because someone's a woman doesn't mean that they have a gender justice agenda or commitment. And secondly, I think that there's also a problem that the representatives in general are very beholden and limited by the policy dictates of the president and of the leadership of the party, and that they in some ways are disciplined in the sense of what comes first and what kinds of initiatives are brought to the floor and prosper and become priorities within the party itself. So I think that both those things are happening there, but we really do need to reflect on how, you know, gender parity, having an equal number in government, is really only half, and maybe even less than that, of the battle itself. And on the corn, yeah, the same programs are what I've heard. I think that the guarantee price of corn was, in the context or about the same time, was raised because of the crisis itself. And that there's also a fairly broad program of support for small producers. And from what I've heard, they're really making an effort to make sure that those supports go to the smallest producers. And so that's essentially what's not clear about it, is how productive it is. It's part of the making sure that the poorest and the people who are most in need of supports receive them, and in this case directed toward the rural sector. But I'm not sure how directed they are toward resolving the problems of production, storage and commercialization that are so severe in the sector as a result of the neoliberal era.
Well, I want to thank both of you very much for sharing all of your knowledge. We're about out of time. Thank you so much for being on our inaugural broadcast. Next Monday, we'll be back at 1 o'clock with Professors Marco Gomez, Celia Pacheco, and Lucero Jimenez to discuss the workers' economy and what the organized, not organized labor in the sense of trade unions, but what workers are doing to survive this period, and to also consider the possibility of the worker takeover of failing businesses, which people don't often think of. And so they'll be on next Monday at 1 o'clock Central Time. So please join us again. I've learned a lot from this program, and especially from all of the questions that people have written in. Thank you very much. The Center for Global Justice has had to cancel all of our revenue making programs. So if you can make a donation to the center, that would be wonderful. I'm sure Laura would appreciate a donation to the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which does such important work about Mexico. And thank you all very much for tuning in. Thank you, Hector. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
And thank you to Colette, Moria, to Liz Mestris, to Gregory Diamond, to Cliff